Hello, can everyone hear me? All right, we're about to have church today. Say less. All right, how's everyone's MAGFest thus far? Fantastic. I am super excited. Hello, everyone. My name is Javon Gord. I am one of your department heads, or archmage, for MAGES, the Music and Gaming Education Symposium, and most recently, one of your new members of the Board of Directors. So now, as one of my colleagues asked, he was like, "Do you feel more powerful?" And I said, "Absolutely not. There are 25,000 of you all here. So no, I'm highly stressed out. But no, I'm actually really excited. It's a blessing and a dream come true to be able to grace you all in these positions, and also to have my friend and colleague, someone who really inspires me. Come on. It's all good. It's all family. There's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 spots up here. Just don't sit where my sandwich is, please. Actually, let me take my sandwich. Yes, I am winging this on the spot. This is what happens when you get to be board of director. Okay. So, thank you all for being here. Again, I'm super excited. He's gonna do a more lengthy academic introduction, more than likely. No. But I just want to say that I met Brother Akil, yes, Dr. Akil, but to me, Brother Akil. So I met Brother Akil through a mutual mentor of ours, and ever since then it's been a beautiful relationship. I got to see their dissertation, through Zoom, at the University of California, Irvine, in the anthropology department, right? And your dissertation used which video game again?
Lots of them, but Final Fantasy XIV was a big one.
Exactly, right? Ooh, spicy. So yes, and ever since then, I've loved the way he thinks, and he also gave me my opportunity, because Brother Akil is also at which university?
Princeton University.
Yes. So, and Brother Akil actually gave me my first opportunity to actually speak at Princeton because, I don't know, I just kind of asked him to. And then he said yes, and then I got to give my own talk at Princeton University, my own self, which is a blessing. And so I'm going to shut up because you're not here to see me, but if you are, let's talk afterwards. But by all means, I'm extremely proud to have you here. This is also Brother Akil's first ever MAGFest, okay? I told him nothing about what he was going to see here. So literally all of this is a surprise to him. But as you all filed in, I said, yeah, I told you you was going to receive a crowd, because when you're an academic, sometimes you're only talking to the same individuals who are ready to critique you right afterwards. But if you're ready to actually talk to the individuals that you legit research about and have no idea that you're talking about them, you need to come to MAGFest. And that was my explanation to him. Yeah, I pay for his hotel too, but he is now here. And so let me stop talking, and everyone, please, another warm welcome to the Dr. Akil Fletcher.
Okay. All right, I am absolutely terrible with mics, so I'm probably going to fade in and out a little bit. But thank you so much, Javon. Speaking of inspirations, this individual is an inspiration. The amount of writing and work that he does for the community and just getting his work out there in a public-facing manner is insane. I cannot keep up, but I love the energy. And anything you need, Javon, I'm here. It is what it is. There you go. Now, like Javon said, my name is Akil Fletcher, Dr. Akil Fletcher. I tell all my students or whoever else to just call me Akil. It's my name. And I am currently a lecturer and member of the Society of Fellows at Princeton University, where I teach a course called Gaming Blackness that engages mostly in narrative design and how race gets used in video games. And you'll see a little bit of that today. And truth be told, presentations are great, but I prefer engagement. I prefer call and response and being able to like ask questions and answer questions. So I will do my best to keep the talky talk part short, and then we can get to having a conversation about what you guys think and feel about anything about the presentation, or just any other questions that you might have. I'm happy to talk about what it's like to just be a big nerd in academia, and how, you know, Princeton doesn't understand me, but I still convince them to give me money to take students to Japan and, you know, do stuff. So either way. All right, so Today's conversation is going to be masked off how non-black developers tell non-black stories with black faces. And this is always an interesting conversation. Video games, obviously, are not always developed by black individuals, percentage-wise a little under 2%. And this has resulted in most of the black characters you see being designed by, I'm going to have to keep like swirling my finger on this. Most of the characters you see being designed by non-black individuals, and this has tons of effects in how we perceive and engage with representation going forward. But before we get there, let's start with Forspoken. So, Forspoken is a Japanese-American developed video game released in 2023, and it centers around the protagonist, Frey Holland, or Al Frey Holland, developed by Square Enix and Luminous Productions. Now, this game has a bit of a reputation around it, specifically within the streaming community and other individuals who engage with it. But for the black community, when it first had released, I say black community, it's really communities, but we're not going to get into the monolithic thing right now. But for black individuals, many of them, when I was researching, this game was a breath of fresh air on the trailer release, right? It was a video game that presented a black woman protagonist that had magic, that was moving around, had awesome movements, and the graphics had looked really stellar. The story, until we got to know what it was, seemed like it was captivating enough to hold individuals captive. Now, there was a point where I was on Twitter and talking to folks through Discord during one of the press releases for the game where Tom Keegan, the voiceover direction, specifically went, and she has a very hip-hoppy kind of walk. Now, this was the exaggerated swagger of a black teen moment for Forspoken. And, you know, I don't want to hold that comment too high because it was actually made by a black person. But this individual, this is when lots of us black game researchers were like, this game is there's going to have some problems, right? This was the moment where we realized that there was a complete disconnect from the black experience and developing Frey's character. The game also has lots of other issues in terms of how it presented Frey, for the fact that there were no black writers when developing this, and it follows many of the same basic tropes that you see black characters in her engagements in criminality, of being in a rough-to-do situation. And while I came from a rough-to-do situation in New York like Frey, there's nothing wrong essentially with giving you a downtrodden character. When the black characters that you present only exist within this realm of criminality or these very specific stereotypes, it becomes very, very problematic very quickly, and you just keep getting the same things over and over again, like that one side mohawk with the locks, like, you know, that Echo and everybody else has, despite me loving Echo in the first place. Now, for me, it's always helpful for me to look at things through the lens of individuals who've come before us, and Du Bois, or W.E.B. Du Bois, is a fantastic individual for the understanding of double consciousness and understanding essentially the veil, so I'll read that in its entirety. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled striving, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Now, this obviously comes from Souls of Black Folk in 1903, and this essentially is speaking to the black experience in America, where you must not only view yourself as a black individual, but you have to also understand how other individuals, specifically a white population, views you as well, because you must also act upon how you want to see yourself and how you are going to be viewed. Now, the funny thing about media as we get into film and television and especially video games, is that this double consciousness, this veil that Du Bois talks about later within his work, means that everything that you see on television is developed through that secondary lens. It's developed through the way individuals want to see you or purport to see you as, rather than you being able to provide yourself your own visualization in this case. And Du Bois's double consciousness and the understanding of the veil is incredibly important, because as we get into video games and even things like Good Times and other stuff like that, which, you know, we can talk about black film and television another time, is that you get to play as a secondary veil, and you get to actually see what the digital representation is of what individuals see as black people, right? Because there's so little interaction from black developers, you are essentially playing through the white or the non-black imagination when you play as a black character. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I do want to start this off by saying, like, I don't necessarily hate the idea of non-black individuals making black characters. It has to be done in a very particular way, but the reality is that there are plenty of black there are plenty of black characters and other things like that that I grew up loving, and you can hate something that doesn't necessarily, I mean, you could love something that doesn't represent you in the best light all the times, but there's going to have to be something special about it as we go forward and see. Now, discussing the veil, we can see the ways how the representation or the imagery of blackness came up in video games through two of its early representations, both in Sega Heavyweights Champ 1976 and Atari Basketball 1979, because the place where black people were showing up within the cultural zeitgeist a lot of time were in sports, right? So a lot of the reasons why you don't have black individuals and black developers in many of these cases, like in the work of Charlton McAway and other things like that, and like black software, is the fact that all the places where computer technology and then eventually video games were being developed did not have a lot of black users and places in it, right? So early games like Space War that was developed in MIT, at a time where even though MIT did allow black individuals in, the recruiters and individuals who wanted to be within that space did not go to black neighborhoods, did their best to recruit outside of black neighborhoods, and it also meant that you were not finding black individuals in many of these tech-represented space, which is problematic, and we can see the effects of that now. Now, without that idea or engagement of that lived experiences, you find that when black individuals are represented in video games, when the software could, handle it, because of course, early representation, nobody was really represented, it was just a bunch of pixels of different colors. But once color was able to be represented, you find black individuals showing up where they were popular within the white zeitgeist, and sports is obviously one of the big one. Like I said, Sega obviously working for Japanese development, and Atari Basketball for US representation. Now, with this creation of stereotypes and limitations, you can see there are tons of different characters here, and it's essentially going to be engaging with some of these characters. I've chosen a few games that I'd like to talk about with you all today, but you see the way in which blackness doesn't necessarily get engaged with in an honest way, but rather is distilled into a product that can sort of be understood by the player base, which largely, of course, is being made for from white developers to white gamers in this case, NBA, 2K, all these other things, which we'll have a conversation about as we get there farther within sports games. But even often with my class, I'll have them play World of Warcraft, and I'll separate them all into different races, and then have them write back on the ways in which that race was used to develop these secondary races. And of course, if you're familiar with the trolls, Jamaican accent, Haitian religion, it's a hodgepodge of things that make it appear that the American consciousness can engage with what they think is black rather than actually engaging with what is, in that case, something that is understandable. Now, so we can look at this and begin to look at blackness in terms of the veil. So sports games is a tough one to talk about lots of the time, because sports games have a deep tradition within the black community. Lots of black gaming is, if you look at the history of what black gaming is, it is a communal event. It is folks getting around, playing together, engaging in things. It is memories of my grandfather giving me a 25, a quarter to go play Marvel vs. Capcom 2 while, I just got my shape up done. He's getting his hair cut. Go play that game while you're waiting. And, the other black kids in the neighborhood that are coming around to play that in the same case. And sports games, once consoles enter the home, is definitely one of those moments where individuals were engaging in communal play. The other aspect is that in terms of esports, even though black individuals have very low representation within PC esports like League of Legends or Dota or Valorant, there is a big representation within sports games, specifically 2K. A lot of the top players are indeed black, and of course, the fighting game community will come up in just a moment. But at the same time, this is literally most of what representation is for black individuals. If you want to find where black individuals are showing up in games, it is mostly about 80% into sports games, right? You are going to find, this is where you'll find the majority of black individuals. This is where you'll find blackness on display, where it is being this quote unquote star of the aspect, and it just displays the limitations of what the imagination is doing for blackness, and it limits where it is you'll find black individuals in games. Now, one of the games that I love engaging with my students is Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. If you're familiar, it's a good game. It's fun. Lots of other reasons. Now, GTA is so interesting because it is often the game that gets brought up when individuals want to talk about violence in games and all these other things, and it's often critiqued for its over-violence and all these other things. And I have legitimate critiques of GTA, especially San Andreas, specifically in terms of its misogynoir, the way it handles its women, all these other things within the game. But surprisingly enough, Rockstar, for a company being developed by two Englishmen and all these other aspects, there is a powerful political critique that happens within this game, specifically because they did work with black individuals when making this game in terms of the music and trying to create this sort of parodied life of what gang life and gang violence looks like within LA. And for the most part, the game does a pretty decent job of engaging with it. Now, my critiques from San Andreas comes in because the two individuals that worked on this game, one being, I'm forgetting their name, I'll grab them in a second, but a white individual and then DJ Pooh. And this is always interesting because sometimes there is a reality where even black individuals, because of the system that they work in, will still carry on levels of anti-blackness or create sort of white imagined stories. And Grand Theft Auto is one that, when we get into the critiques of the class, is, if you're familiar with the game, and I'm sorry for spoiling this, right, towards the end, it essentially does a recreation of the LA riots or 1992 riots, or uprisings in this case, and the game's message immediately turns from one that was embracing this sort of black life and showing the humanity of individuals that are engaged in gang warfare or violence in many of these cases, and showing that gangs were not developed as just some form of barbaric, means to fight, but we're actually there to support the community, to engage with what the community needs were, and provide protection where protection was not had, especially in times of police brutality in a post Black Panther period. But it then moves from this into purporting a very white liberal logic of uprising's bad, you can't destroy your own neighborhood, you're burning things down, this isn't the wake sort of aspect, without actually engaging the message of why riots or uprisings happen in the first place, right? So obviously you have MLK up there in terms of his own quote of riots being the language of the unheard. The characters in this game essentially remain unheard for what uprisings actually do or why they take place, and instead just goes with, well, this is just bad for whatever reason it may be happening, no matter what the history may be, no matter what it looks like. And here you see the way in which that, even though that this game is starring black individuals, it takes a black body, specifically in that of CJ, and oh shit, here we go again, and then completely reforms it to perform, in the end, to provide a message that uplifts or upholds a white logic of violence bad no matter what, and there's no way of seeing, in that or not. So you have this softening of the message, which lots of media does with it, with black families. I had mentioned Family Matters, or even, let's say, Fresh Prince, or why am I forgetting the show where Urkel comes from? But many of these black TV shows actually had a lot of white showrunners, and it was made to show, it was engaged in sort of respectability politics, that black individuals can be the same upper middle class workers that everybody else can if you give us a shot and put us in the suburbs and do what we have to do. But it was very much shows that made white folks who are watching it feel safe, that we have that black individuals can, quote unquote, be human. Now, so the last game I want to talk about in this case, coming from the western side of games, or rather the global north, is going to be Telltale's The Walking Dead. Now, full disclosure, I love this game. I love Lee, I love Clementine. I think there's a lot of good stuff to engage here, and lots of stuff to love, especially for this sort of narratology versus ludology argument that happens a lot in game studies. But here's a game that survives entirely off of its narrative, right? You're just clicking, you're doing whatever, but you're still engaged because the story is good. However, Robert Kirkman, if you've read the Walking Dead comics or other things like that, does not do a very great job of writing black characters. It's not great in The Walking Dead. It's not great in Invincible, something that I hope gets better as the series goes on. But here we have a work that's inspired by Robert Kirkman and new writers, who is essentially a mostly white team, that takes this and tries to give it a wonderful twist in this. Now, Walking Dead is an interesting story because some of the primary characters, like Michonne, are black individuals who have super duper badass moments. But even here, you see the limitations of where blackness can reside, and that Lee is, your immediate introduction to him is that he is, again, exposed within criminality. He is in the back of a cop car. You don't know what's happening. The man is literally a professor who had just committed, unfortunately, a act of violence. But it doesn't start with the fact that he's a professor. It doesn't take us through him finding his wife with another individual, and then it doesn't take us through the act of violence that happens. It simply says, here is a criminal, and now you have to perform in this game and survive, especially the first chapter, as a criminal. Much of this information does not come out until you have secondary interactions with individuals, which is perfectly fine. You know, the storytelling, the quote unquote, the show don't tell aspect is wonderful to engage with. But what they told from the start is Lee is essentially a criminal. The game then goes on to have this beautiful sort of engagement of fatherhood, which we can talk about and engage in, especially in the ways in which black characters often are given children, especially black men are given young children to take care of, as it's a way for blackness to become accessible to non-black individuals. Even if you can't see this person as a human, he has a child, everybody can understand, protecting a child. It's one of those ways that softens, i.e. Barrett, Saz, Final Fantasy, all these other things that comes through. But the game introduces Lee in a way that is problematic just to start with. And Clementine, something that we can definitely have more discussion about in terms of it. Clementine is a super badass character, but even she, in a zombie apocalyptic world, is forced to grow up in a way that is incredibly quickly, forced to take care of AJ, the child that she takes care of in the later chapters, and is also written at times to be just aggressively violent in some cases, and most of the time is just, she's just not taking any shit, which, let's go Clementine, but with stereotypes of how black women can be perceived, it can be a very dangerous line to walk across when engaging with these characters. So we have this sort of engagement of blackness in the US and within Western games, specifically Canada, the US, and Europe. But then there's also another aspect of where blackness is coming from in terms of the Japanese market or Japanese game developers. Now, we talked about Sega's Fight Night being one of the first representations of black individuals, but, well, that's actually way louder. But Japanese video games, despite recreating some of the same harms and sometimes doing much better, is also coming from a very, very different history in terms of it. So, in the wake of World War II, obviously, we have a Japan that is being helped rebuilt by the US, and through this you have lots of individuals, specifically black GIs, that set down within Japan in a position where now there is an interaction between black and Japanese people directly. Of course, earlier, this isn't the first times. We can talk about Yasuke in the 16th century and all these other things, but this is a moment where blackness is in direct contact with Japan. However, what's also coming is the history or the media, the sort of soft power from the US that's coming over, and a lot of this obviously comes from animation, from TV shows and other things like that, where black individuals are not portrayed in the best light. Now, here's an earlier cartoon. If you're unfamiliar with the history of cartoons, cartoons come directly or build directly on minstrel shows, and they're essentially animated minstrel shows, and you can see a lot of that in the beginning. And this is Disney's melodrama to show you that the mouse is not clean in this discussion. And this is not the only one. There are plenty of problematic racialized aspects within Disney, within Warner Brothers. I'm sure many of individuals have seen Bugs Bunny fighting with indigenous Americans, with African Americans, many of those other things. And this history or these animations essentially did make their way to Japan in many of these cases. And you have, in terms of animation, lots of anime that recreate this sort of aspect. And I'm talking about anime because it's also just a huge influence for Japanese developed video games. Persona fans, I am one. Anime inspired. Final Fantasy, anime inspired, right? And often early depictions of black individuals, whether or not it being like Cyborg 007, Shaman King, this is your friend Choco Love here. That is, yeah, the name was changed in the US, distribution and like 4Kids and other things. It was named to Jocko, but yeah, his original name is Choco Love. You can see here with the big lips, protruding nose, very much in this minstrel-esque belly button in many of these cases. The enlarged stomach was also a very popular minstrel image. You can see Mickey copying this up here with the stuffed stomach in the melodrama. And this essentially meant that the cultural ideas that were influencing the US were also influencing Japan. And it wasn't all bad. We can talk about the good as well, because the American cool was, or the soft power was essentially black culture in terms of music and fashion, but in terms of imagery, it meant that black imagery did not really get the greatest of starts here. Now, something that has been incredibly useful for me, especially when talking to students, is the term mokokuseki, which had went around a couple of years ago within individuals discussing race in Japanese media. And the term essentially means statelessness or nationless. And it is the idea essentially that anime characters don't have like actual ethnicities or races or anything else like that. They are meant to just be colorful characters in all these other ways. And there is some truth to that, right? Naruto is very much Japanese coded in many of these cases, but he is also blonde hair, blue-eyed, and there's very few countries where I could point out where that is natural affinities in many of these cases. But the reality for mokokuseki, or this idea of statelessness, it does not work for black characters, right? Once the skin is applied to a character, it immediately is identifiable as black or brown in many of these cases, and many mangakas lean into this, Killer Bee being a wonderful example of becoming the rapping ninja, and there are plenty of other people from the village of the Hidden Cloud. But in terms of where people will fight tooth and nail to you that Naruto is not a German man but a Japanese man, that same leverage, or rather that same leniency is not given to Killer Bee. Killer Bee is a black man and thus removed from that sort of Japanese identity in many of these cases, which means that blackness as an identity, as a station for the use of media, contains its own particular essence in this case. And I'm not trying to essentialize this in any way, but either way. Now, one of the places that we can sort of see this happen is Blackness in Final Fantasy. Now, Final Fantasy VII, of course, being where Barrett makes their introduction, is a place where lots of individuals are in that game that are not directly applicable to, like, where are they from? I always play this game of, like, tell me where Cloud is from. In many of these cases with my class, and they typically don't have an answer. Some say Japanese, some say European, some mix around. But as you can see, Barrett does not necessarily have that same answer, and is very much in the way of where you can see how blackness shows up within the sort of Japanese mindscape, specifically in his performance as a sort of Mr. T-esque rendition. Often what's happening with black characters in, often what's happening in Japanese characters, black characters in Japanese video games, is that they're pulling directly from American media or famous black individuals, Mike Tyson obviously being a big one, and Punch-Out and all these other places, Barrett coming from Mr. T, and this idea of blackness then not necessarily allowing to inhabit any form of imagination, but rather is being rendered simply of just like, okay, well, I see black people do that, let's make it this way, and it limits what blackness can be, and essentially takes it outside of this huge form of imagination that inhabits every video game. This game is a steampunk like masterpiece that makes all these characters have cool outfits and cool moves and does all this other stuff. And while I appreciate Barrett for being this hyper socialist like climate activist that's like, well, they're not gonna take it down, so we're just gonna blow this shit up, and I'm just like, he's kind of speaking. And even in when they update his character in the remake, because now Barrett is not my favorite socialist philosopher because he was saying whatever, but even then they're still limiting what Barrett can be. And here we see the recreation of the trope of Barrett's character being a very hard and gruff man, but being softened through the inclusion of a child, where you can understand where he's fighting from, because you might not understand saving the planet, or blackness and sort of radical ideology often comes off as very negative or very unapproachable. See this with Black Panther, see this with MLK. I know every year people come back and there's always an MLK quote by some Republican somewhere, but people are forgetting that they hated him, they murdered him, he had very low approval ratings, and even though he believed in nonviolence, his movements were still radical and violent to the actions of the state. Sitting around in a place where people cannot do business is harming capital. Capital is going to be a thing. I'm not going to get on my soapbox, but you see the ways, you see the limitations and where this is happening. So to soften the reality of what black politics could be in a video game, there's always going to be some sort of reinvigoration or turn to saying, okay, well, we're not really a violent people, riots are bad, or let's give them a kid, let's soften it up some way, somehow. Now, all of this is incredibly problematic, and it's not great. It essentially means that blackness is basically limited to a few spaces in some of these cases, and where you might want to imagine other identities, other possibilities. It's always going to be stuck within this sort of liberal framing that brings back blackness to whatever is safe, whatever can work within the system. There is no moving outside of it because that gets scary, that gets problematic. We don't want to do that. Now, while all of this sucks, there is resistance. And the idea that blackness is limited to imagination to Western and Eastern, or rather the global North in its entirety, is very ironic because the history of blackness in the US, of black writers, of black storytellers, is that of imagination, right? It is Afrofuturism. It is looking outside of what it is now, because the world we have now is at times uninhabitable, and all you can really do is imagine new ones. You make up new stories. This is where you have even stories that deal with the ones we have, like Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sawyer and other things like that, still do their work of imagining new worlds of what happens after, you know, all of this ends or burns down in some of these cases. California, I'm so sorry. And blessings to that. Ironically, it's so prophetic. The book takes place in 2025 and California is on fire. It's not looking good. And it's also a despotic president. You know what, maybe not get political. Sorry. Now, feel free to chew me out for that afterwards. I'm sorry. So there are aspects of black individuals taking back or reacting, because it's essentially, what do you do? Let me make sure. Oh, 3:30, right? So there is a reality of, like, what do you do then, right? What do black individuals do when you don't have representation? If the games aren't providing stories, if they are limited, how do you go beyond that and find representation within your games? If these storytellers are going to essentially tell non-black stories with black bodies, what do you do in that? So there's a lot of really cool stuff, and research has also been awesome. But one of those aspects is claiming and reinterpretation, right? So the argument of whether or not Piccolo is a black character is still ongoing, but most of the people. There you go. We can start it. I don't mean to finish it, but from my understanding, Piccolo does get an invite to the cookout. So there is. Now, so in response to the lack of black characters, you have individuals claiming characters. You will have, obviously, fan art. Here's the Don fan art that set Twitter on fire about a month ago, because people don't like seeing darker skin tones. I'm sorry. But essentially, this is important because fan art provides a way for underrepresented bodies to essentially see themselves in animations that they love. Lots of folks, myself, my daughter, big Sailor Moon fan. Not much you can do other than, you know, draw your own black Sailor Scout, right? There's lots of things going there. But there are also aspects of black individuals, especially black workers, who are not essentially directly present, presenting themselves or allowing their identity or blackness to perceive through. Kratos essentially being, which is, it's funny that I do a lot of research in like black communities, and people will fight tooth and nail that Kratos is a black man because his skin is just ashen white, and that he's actually like a darker Greek individual that made it there and whatever else. But it doesn't matter, right? Because the reality is that not only is his voice actor black, but his voice actor, which, because I'm nervous, I'm forgetting their name, but it's okay, I'll get back to that. Mike Judge, thank you, popped up. Mike Judge very much went on and said, like, this is a, like, my voice acting in this is very much an ode to my son. This is the story of a black father speaking to his black son, even though Atreus is not that direct black son. The reality of it is that behind the scenes, when Mike Judge is speaking into this character and performing Kratos, he is imagining being a black father and what it means to become a black father. And you can very much see that told throughout Kratos' story, even if Kratos himself is not a black character, which is also why Kratos gets a special spot within the black gaming archive, and he'll be found up there in God of War and God of War Ragnarok, which are fantastic games. Now, the last line of aspect of this, come on, no signal there, but is going to be community building. So this is basically where my bread and butter is, where all my research is, of me spending time within Final Fantasy XIV communities, of Black Discords, of Facebook groups and other things like that. But in order to deal with, A, the lack of representation and the sometimes toxic community that can come from the focus on what is typically a white heterosexual male identity, it can often be toxic to interact with fans that when you come and say, like, hey, I'd love to see a black character, I'd love to see a queer character, often the result is just to make your own space where individuals will not judge you for having those wants, needs, or complaints. Now, community building is incredibly important because this is how this happens. This is how MAGFest happens. This is how Evo happens. This is how lots of individuals engage. And like I said, Black play has always been communal. It's always been getting down, hop on the sticks, get this work in Street Fighter 6. It is what it is. I'm very okay at that game. I only play Jury. I listened to Sonic Fox yesterday, and he's like, you got to play a different character. I was like, I'm going to play Jury till I die. I was like, I have not learned another one. I refuse to pick up and learn Zangief. I will not throw anyone. But community building is obviously an important aspect. Now, the other way in which that Black resistance is had, or where you get to see a bit of Black representation that is obviously told from Black individuals, is within the developer and the indie game community. Now, AAA studios obviously make up the majority of like what folks are talking about, whether or not it is your Sega, I was gonna say Atlas, but Atlas is owned by Sega, blah, blah, blah. It is your Sega, it is your Rockstar, it is your Santa Monica Studios in many of these cases. But there is lovely representation to be found within indie games, and it's a very troubling thing to discuss simply because indie games shouldn't bear the work of making representation a thing. Like it shouldn't be like, oh, if you want a Black game, just go play the indie game, right? Like no, there should be room and space in both the AAA titles and the indie or single A or AA in any of these cases. But I would still be remiss if I didn't mention the wonderful work that's being done in terms of folks like Aerial Knight and Never Yield, and Momo Pixel and Here Now, which of course is just a very quick it is just a very quick HTML, I was going to say Flash, but I'm like, Flash is dead last time I checked. Game that, exactly. You can play it on your mobile phone, lots of cases, that allows you to engage and slap away hands. And truthfully, this one's interesting because the game really isn't, like, the game isn't meant to be a walk in my shoes sort of experience. The game is very much like unabashedly meant for Black women, right? It is meant for you to slap away the hands and find catharsis in that aspect, even though the hands coming can feel very claustrophobic and all these other things. And of course, Orion Legacy of Fire, which is a Cameroonian-developed game and is absolutely wonderful. So play any of these games if you like, but there are Black developers that are making things, but of course, when you are shouting into the maw, that it can be very difficult to get what you need out of it. So to not end on a completely terrible note in many of these cases, we understand the fact that Black characters essentially still get used to replace or to retell politics that work within liberal framing, specifically that of Western ideology. But there are also aspects of individuals fighting back, and we can see this, we can start seeing the impacts of that because representation has gotten better. It's not perfect, it's not nearly where it needs to be, but you can see the influence of Black individuals working hard to find their representation within the space, and there are truly exciting examples or individuals that it just hypes the community up. Of course, Leroy from Tekken was a huge thing. T-Pain did a wonderful cosplay and things like that. And even though Leroy plays very much on Blaxploitation imagery and other things like that, I cannot bring myself to hate the man. Bring your pit bull. You're invited to the cookout. It is an invitation. He made it. He was on the grill. Obviously. Miles Morales, when the first game came out, even though that game was very much shortened and was sort of a disservice in some cases, when everybody saw that hairline, they were like, whoo, that boy clean. Right? And this is one of those things. Nessa, of course, I'm a huge Pokemon fan. It's a little upsetting that even in Hawaii, there was very little Afro engagement in sort of Afro cultures and things like that. But Pokemon does have some great Black designs, Nessa being one of them. What is basically England and Scotland and the game. But I support Nessa, do it. I also like that they went against the stereotype of not being able to swim. That is a Black water gym leader. She did it. I'm proud of her. And of course, I'm going to end here with Aveline Day Grand Prix, which in Assassin's Creed Liberation is always one of the best games for me to engage with because even though the game plays like a brick, largely due to Ubisoft putting it on the PSP and not giving it a chance to fully shine. It had limited development and all these other things that were going on. They still did something fascinating with Aveline being able to move between her slave garb and her lady garb and her assassin garb and being able to engage with antebellum New Orleans culture in a way that is very, very fascinating. Obviously, engaging with voodoo or hoodoo in many of these cases, and all these other things. It is a wonderful sort of experience to engage with, and if you want a game to learn from, it's absolutely great. Now, essentially, where do we go from here? Now, I realize that often when I give these talks, I'm just like, sad stuff. Goodbye. But I do want to start offering some things that individuals can do and other things like that. So one of my pet peeves is the attempt I do think if you're going to perform photorealism, you do need a way to make blackness legible in a way that, my hair, squiggly lines aren't like cutting through my face and all these other things. But I do think photorealism limits creativity in a way that the only way that you imagine blackness is like, let me try to make a real black person so black people don't get upset. There are so many art styles and so many different ways that you can have fun and kooky, creative and cute, different interpretations of blackness and still fully be understood as a black character and be respectful, right? So I want folks to move away from photorealism in an attempt to try to appease blackness and engage any form of artistic style that allows you to just engage. And you will find that doing that and creating black characters will be a bit better. The other one is embrace the diaspora. Blackness is not a monolith. We are all very different. I, for sure, am Trinidadian. If I go up to random people and say, I like Pelori and doubles, people will be like, what the f are you talking about? But nonetheless, there are lots of aspects. I would love to see a proper, AAA Caribbean mythology engaged game. Black Myth Wukong, lots of problems in terms of the viewer developing, and that weird like anti-feminist stuff was nonsense, but it was a game that engaged Chinese myth in a way that lots of others haven't. So keep moving in that direction. Just stop being weird, stop being bigots. It's weird. The other one is support black game workers and communities. Of course, one of the best ways to engage with that, of course, every black story is going to be different, but having black eyes and voices in your writer's room and your development space is going to be great. I remember I went to GDC, somebody was like, I want to make a black game, I want to make a game where this black guy in the 70s fight people with like disco music, and I'm like, okay, I mean, I like disco music, it was a thing, it was important, but how is this going? I was like, do you have anybody, you're working with? And he's like, nah, I'm just gonna make what I like. If they're upset, it is what it is. I'm like, cool, don't do that. So, talk to black folks, do what you can there. And the other one is don't be afraid to fail. There is so many games where it's just like, oh, we made a game, the black community didn't like it, so let's never make a black character again. Let's have a Forspoken and then never make a Forspoken 2 because folks, we're talking about bad writing and Asmongold got on and said whatever he said about anything. But the reality is that learning and creating proper representation is not an overnight thing. You're probably going to mess up, especially if you're not engaging within the community. And because there are so few of us working in game development, games research, and game anything, there are going to be very limited voices to pull from. So it's trial and error, right? There are so many games that fail with white and Asian bodies, and they just go on and make more and do what they want. But every time there is a queer body or a black queer body or any of these cases and somebody makes a game, and it's just like, well, the game was bad because of DEI, chuck it, throw it out, let's do it, never do it again. From now on, only white men, this is what sells. So either way. But with that being said, I am running a little bit more than I would like to. But I want to say thank all of you for coming in. This was amazing. This room is huge, and thank you. If you want to engage with me or anything like that, you feel free to email me or follow me on Twitter or Blue Sky. Twitter is very much a cesspit. It's a cesshole. But there's good arguments for black people, especially in the existence of black Twitter, to stay on the ship until it sinks. So I'm there either way. Now I love questions. I would love engagement. I'm sorry I took longer than I would like to, but we still got 15 plus minutes. Let's do it. I want to talk. Whoever you like, just a friend. Don't talk. You have the mic, sir. Sorry, please.
I want to say thank you so much for this presentation. I know you said, Dr. Akil, you're a professor at Princeton.
Yes.
We're based out of North Brunswick.
Oh, nice.
I was going to ask if you have any upcoming talks that are open to the public that we might be able to attend that we could add to our calendars, because we'd love to see your work again.
Yeah, so Black History Month, I'm supposed to be doing a talk for Brock University in Toronto. I am not going to be, it's going to be digital, but it's going to be open to the public, and it's just going to be engaging with the history of black game developers and folks that we've sort of left out of the story as we told. So everything from Jerry Lawson to Bill Gillis and other folks that folks might not have heard about. So yeah, feel free to attend that. Please. And there was a hand in the back, individual. No, you can give him the question, but just get to the. You can give him the mic. Do whatever. But there was a hand. This gentleman back here. His hand was up first. So I do want to get him.
All right. Thank you very much for this talk as well. A question. So as you were saying, the majority of folks in the industry are white, and as a queer person, also cis, usually heteronormative presenting. How would you address, as a person in a minority situation talking to a majority group, to incorporate ideas for them to essentially experiment and help kind of be more diverse without them closing the door on you, so to speak?
Yeah, that's hard. The door has been closed many times already in lots of these cases. The reality is that there's just going to have to be banging on the door. There's always a fear that when you're like, okay, let's have a black character, that then again that gets co-opted to then tell these non-black stories. It's the the undateable black best friend or all these other things that show up. And every time you pitch even black games, they then get toned down to other aspects. And this isn't to say that like there aren't black people with quote unquote like white liberal politics or any of this other stuff. Like there definitely are. But it really is just engaging and I want to say demanding that sort of space to be able to share and whatnot, because no matter what you do, no matter where you show it, like there are going to be thousands of random people on Twitter talking about DEI and all these other things, and it is about proving individuals that not only can these games sell, but that they sell, that like it's not just about the sales, but it's also just effective storytelling, that there's more to expand on other than just like your Greek mythology, your Western, your other things like that. Like there are other huge, pantheons and things like that that have been unexplored in some of these cases. And sometimes it's about working your way up. I don't like doing that, but it is also just continuously demanding in some of these cases because there's no perfect answer. I can get into a spiel about how capitalism dictates, there needs to be a specific, form of whiteness that exists and what sells to a largely white population. So it's usually just like not enough to be like, hey, I have a great black game. Be like, okay, but who's buying it? So it's rough. Yeah.
Doctor, can you speak up, please?
I'm so sorry. I can do that. I'll just hold it like this. I should have done this all talk. Anyway.
Hello? Oh, hi. My name is Louis. I'm from the University of Texas San Antonio. I'm a doctoral student there.
Beautiful.
Thank you. My research focuses around education, specifically curriculum and instruction, but I really love gaming and I really love just the community and those types of things. I love that. My question has to deal with a lot of, it was actually a question to ask, what are some ways or examples that you have seen that have been able to express black stories in a way that, as you were saying, avoid this, how do I put this, the proximity to whiteness, stereotype, and how to not be in that mindset, and not, of course, also not just for black communities, queer communities, indigenous communities, and other marginalized communities?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's always a hard one. In terms of AAA games, there's almost none. I think there are beautiful like black stories I can engage with. Like I said, I love the Walking Dead. I love Miles Morales' story and all these other things. But many of these things just are incorporated, like you said, within that proximity to whiteness. Comic books, Miles Morales still drops off everybody to the police, despite the fact that they would very much treat him differently than Peter had he taken off the mask. There's lots of engagements in that case, and you can still love these stories. I do think there are sparks of hope and joy in some of these cases. The work on like Senna and League of Legends, or even sometimes Echo in some of these cases, you can tell very much were from like the Riot Noir and had black teens work on them and develop these like cool stories and designs and other things like that, and then they just sort of get lost in the void. But yeah, truthfully, it is indie games that are providing the best experiences for quote unquote like non-traditional bodies in this case, which is unfortunate because indie games obviously don't have the reach, they don't have the funding, but they're still doing the best work in my opinion. So yeah. Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
So I wanted to circle back to something a bit more specific from earlier
Yeah.
about Piccolo.
Yeah.
So I'm a big Dragon Ball fan, and if you ask me, like, automatically, like, oh yeah, Piccolo's black,
Yeah.
but I generally could not tell you why I think that.
Yeah.
Like, I genuinely, like, could not connect the dots there. But there's like, I generally don't know why. I'm kind of trying to ask you, like, why do you think that people make that association, make that connection?
Yeah.
And I'm trying to analyze if there's anything deeper I need to be worried about, or if there's, you know, I want to reflect on that, is what I want to do.
It's okay. There is definitely some osmosis there happening in terms of just like the black community said Piccolo's black, so now I too say Piccolo is black. The irony there, right, with Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z is that Dragon Ball has black characters, right? And very, like, if you go back to the original Dragon Ball, Mr. Black is a very racialized character, big lips, all the other like classic stuff, and then Mr. Popo, which of course is focused on Jin and you know more different forms of Middle Eastern and Indian mythology, but very much still has all of those like black mammy, black minstrel-esque figures. So when people are like, it's not actually black, it's like, no, shut up, it's there. But you know, the reason why Piccolo is considered black is this aspect of claiming or engaging with characters, right? Like I remember doing an interview with a woman, a Jamaican woman who we were talking about Inuyasha, and she was like, Sango's a black character. And she was like, I feel that way because like there's no other woman on that show that represents this sort of like black woman experience of like having to care for everybody but still getting like the shortest end of the stick and all these other things other than Sango. Whereas like Inuyasha and Kagome and all these other folks are thing. Also like there was some very deep cuts there in terms of the sexual harassment from Moroku, but that's a whole other thing. But the reality is that Piccolo often gives off some of these black essence vibes, which, not to essentialize it, but in a character lineup where there is absolutely no black characters, the one where Piccolo A is not white, so it is easier to latch onto that because there's no one trying to defy you or things like, well, we don't really know what he is. I mean, for me, it's also just like there's like ball black dad vibes there going on as well, taking care of Gohan and all these other things. But the reality is like a lot of traits that Piccolo has is the ones that we see from black fathers within the community and other things like that, despite the belief or the myths of like black fathers are never around and all these other things. Yeah, Piccolo has those vibes. So it's something that has been created, it's continued, and it's something that just sort of developed out of the black community almost entirely on its own, unlike Knuckles, who like has a lot of hip hop music to sort of start that flame. But, you know, either way.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
I guess two things. One, you mentioned Final Fantasy XIV, and it reminded me of a conversation I had with a friend about Aaronville from Endwalker and Dawn Trail, who is literally a literal black rabbit man.
Yes. Yes.
And I was like, wait, she said something like, I'm glad the one person of color gets more view. And I'm like, wait, who are you talking about? And then I was like, she's like, Aaronville. And I'm like, oh yeah, he's literally black.
Yeah.
So I just thought that was funny. But my actual question is, I guess I grew up, my family had a decent amount of wealth, so I kind of grew up outside of the black experience. Mm-hmm. So a lot of what I view as being like that is stuff that I haven't really experienced. It's changed as I've gotten older, obviously, and met more people. But when I was young, it was very different for me. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, if I make a black character and they aren't like not necessarily stereotypical, but still kind of lacking the more stuff we associate with black people, like the more positive stuff even. Is that not like black enough for people? Is it fine?
No, there's the idea of trying to be black enough is a lost race. Like there's no need to do that. The black experience is different for everybody. I had a very different experience than lots of folks. Some folks had it, some folks didn't. And it's very much okay. Like whatever your experience was a black experience. Like that's just what it is. And whether or not you make a game full of, like, the idea of a stereotype is very much like that common belief, and stereotypes exist in video games to make that game understandable, right? So when like World of Warcraft was being developed and they were like, okay, let's make trolls, we want to make them like this like Polynesian-esque Caribbean sort of community, they're like, okay, how do we make this like more relatable, right? So so they give them a bunch of things randomly hodgepodge from the Caribbean, and then they go, well, nobody knows where Haiti is, so we're gonna give them Jamaican accents because Jamaica is a very popular accent within the American zeitgeist. Cool. So that's what they do, right? So the stereotypes are there. Stereotypes essentially in gaming are tools to make the games more relatable to a wider audience who may not necessarily understand what blackness or any form of blackness is in that case. But if you make a game that's outside these stereotypes, it only elevates what blackness in video games can be. It's offering more stories and more pathways to engage with, and that can only be a beautiful thing in most of these cases, right? And it will be a very different thing coming from your own unique black experience, and I think that's great. Trust me, your character does not need to play basketball. He doesn't need to be in the hood. He doesn't have to do all these other stuff, right? He can avoid he or she can avoid the black nerd stereotypes, and they can avoid the black gangster stereotypes. Like there's nuance.
Hi.
Hi.
Two things. So one, I wanted to circle back to Clementine for one moment.
Yeah.
There's a really interesting aspect that I found to her character in, I'm gonna spoil the ending, part of the ending, because I have to talk about it, where you have an option to give her a love interest, and she gets a male and a female interest.
Yeah.
And one of the most interesting things I found, especially as a black queer person, is even in her queerness, it must be attached to whiteness because the female option is a white woman.
Yeah.
While her male love interest, the hetero one, I'll say that for now, so it's not really straight. But the hetero one is another black man. So there's like an interesting aspect to also talk about there.
Yeah.
But one of the other things I wanted to kind of ask you about is, in your research, have you ever considered like looking at some of the characters that we call black, like Piccolo and Kratos? Have you ever tried looking at it from like the oppositional gaze that Bell Hooks proposed? Because as a communication student, that's also centering kind of their research in fandom and identity politics and all of that. I found that the oppositional gaze is not talked about enough, and I want to hear somebody else's opinion on it.
Yeah. Okay. That's actually great, and that's a solid question. So in terms of engaging it from the oppositional gaze, in terms of engaging it from the oppositional gaze and things like that, unfortunately, where I started from in terms of games research was very much in the case of just like blackness obviously working as this sort of, let's just use it as tool, and this sort of formation that obviously exists post Atlantic slave trade and is now designed to define who is human and who isn't human, right? I very much looked at it in terms of just like blackness engaging as like tool and aspect of just like labeling someone as black, especially within the US context where we very much live on this sort of like white to black dichotomy, and the closer you are to black, the closer you are to inhumanness and obviously being deserving of slavery and blah blah blah, all these other things. Is sort of in that aspect, so I engage with it. But in terms of the engaging with bell hooks and the oppositional gaze, I do think that there is a factor of looking at it that way, because I do think that there is black work in terms of engaging what blackness looks like and not having to be defined by sort of extra, now I'm closing my eyes and this is what I go into like thinking, of having to look at blackness in terms of like what it is defined at other points. But I do find myself sort of clogged into this a little bit. And I recently wrote a chapter called Reformatting Blackness that hopefully will come out eventually. But that is basically looking at like what does blackness look like when there is no blackness, right? When there is no phenotypical design, specifically in Final Fantasy XIV, when the characters don't necessarily get to look all that black. What do these characters do to sort of create black identity and all these other things? And I do think that there's a lot of opportunity to go there. Bell Hooks is someone that I use, but in terms of like black feminist literature, a lot of it is like, things like the Copenhagen River Committee, lots of black literatures, because I like to look, the current book I'm working on looks at like black worlds and evolution and then other things like that. So I can't say much more than that, if that helps. So I appreciate it. But fantastic question. Also, in terms of that rabbit, black skin, I don't consider him as a black character. I was in my head. Sorry.
So this will have to be.
That's fine.
This will have to be the last question for you in this official capacity, brother.
That's
Akil,
fine.
But you'll still be here for like an extra 15 minutes afterwards.
I will
to
be
take more
around.
Questions. All right. So.
Hi, Professor. So I'm also a communication student who's also been researching like Black nerd culture and Black nerd cultural practices, and I was wondering, what's like when you were talking about the act of narrative extraction, like what aspect or like what aspect does the act of like racialization usually play in like narrative extraction in your opinion? Because I have my own theories, and additionally my other question is like, what in your mind or in anyone's mind should constitute good representation?
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, so the first question, I'm sorry, I had a little bit of a hard time hearing. You asked in terms of when does the act of racialization happen? Or?
So my question is about like the act of narrative extraction. So
Yeah.
you know how like a lot of people, like we said, people view Piccolo as black,
Yeah.
and a lot of other characters that we view as like black, such as like in the Star Wars fandom, a lot of people view Ahsoka Tano as being black.
Mhm.
And even though there are a lot of black characters in Star Wars, why would we view Ahsoka Tano as being more black
Yeah.
than somebody like Mace Windu or Finn? So like, what aspect is like, implicit racialization play in the act of narrative extraction, I guess is my question.
Yeah, no. It plays a huge role here, and it's like I said, it's where the fandom gets a lot of their black characters in terms of Piccolo and lots of these other cases, and it's something that has to take place simply because black stories are often hidden and untold in many of these cases, both historically and within video games. But the reality of it is that a lot of these secondary races, like with the trolls and other things like that, are heavily racialized in a way that either create or gesture towards blackness in a way that, if not offensive, can be easy for individuals to latch onto and build community out of it. And sometimes that these characters just get reinterpreted as black characters in a way that even if they were offensive, they take the powerful, great essences out of it that you can grab and make them actually black characters, right? Because again, their blackness within this sort of white space is limited. It often gets lost. It often gets lost in translation. It is not something that is easily identifiable. But the idea of like narrative building with that sort of racialization is that it allows black players to find black characters, but if the writer is smart enough or engaged enough with it, and sometimes this could obviously be used in a negative way, but it allows you to explore blackness in a way that doesn't, like I said, doesn't need the phenotypical. You can make a character black without them having black characters or black skin. Like, we play with so many alien and non-human characters, and it's sort of like Darwin from Gumball in many of these cases, where these characters just like, that is a black character in many of these cases, and it's often just like through little hints of just like Darwin not always being down with the foolishness. It's like yeah, no, a black kid would probably know better. But yeah, and forgive me, the second part of that question? Yeah, sorry, we'll end on that. So good representation is going to be a mix. I'm sorry, Javon, I know I'm not going to take much longer. Good representation is going to be a mix, and often it's going to be an individual experience for like what good representation. I might find Lee Everett to be an okay representation as a black father, as another black father. But truly good representation constitutes thought and care, right? The characters need to be engaged with in a way, because nobody wants a Mary Sue where the character is absolutely perfect, because then sometimes, they're afraid to use black characters in actual stories, and then they're just like, here comes that perfect black guy to like do the thing and then leave and finish the plot. But at the same time, you also don't want to just play as an absolute criminal that's just been running around doing whatever. And sometimes, honestly, some black characters as criminals are great. CJ is a cool character when the plot doesn't absolutely lose it, towards the end there. But it really does come down to thought and care, and we can extrapolate this on that further when I'm not out of time. But thank you so much, everyone, for all of this and all of the questions.
Just like most academics, you don't end on time. Gosh, I have a schedule to upkeep. So again, one more applause for Dr. Akil Fletcher. Thank you. All right, so I have one quick request because he did not expect to have literally a maxed out panel, which is why the door kept closing into because there's more people trying to come in. Okay, we're gonna take one quick group photo. Okay. So can our lovely panel person for the room give it up for our lovely panel person in the room? Thank you.